The Voyage of Odysseus, traditional Greek legend retold by Sally Benson. Odysseus encounters many adventures that delay his return home. As you read, think about how Odysseus reacts to each conflict. What patterns do you see in his actions? When Troy had fallen, Odysseus with his men set sail for home. No sooner were they out of the harbor than a dreadful storm blew up and drove their ship from its course. For 9 days they were hopelessly lost at sea. Finally, they sighted a small island, the country of the lotus eaters. Almost dying of thirst, the men first set out to look for water. When they had refreshed themselves, Odysseus told them to explore the island and find out who the inhabitants were. Soon the men came upon a group of people who received them hospitably and offered them some of their own food, the lotus plant, to eat. Odysseus's men did not know the power of the lotus leaf. Anyone who ate one immediately forgot all about home and family and wanted to remain forever on the island. Half-starved and flattered by the attention shown them by the islanders, the men from the ship were only too happy to sit down at the table and eat. Odysseus waited a while for his soldiers and then went in search of them. He saw them feasting and saw what they were eating. Knowing what effect the sweet-tasting lotus would have on them, he begged them to come home with him. The men, who were by this time in dreamy half-sleep, did not even hear him. By force, he dragged them away and tied them to the benches of the ship until he hoisted the sails and got under way. The sea air soon cleared their heads, and they sailed on. After many days, they sighted the country of the Cyclops. These huge giants each had but one eye, which was placed in the middle of the forehead. They lived in caves and tended their flocks, eating whatever roots and wild grasses grew on the rocky shores. Odysseus left the main body of his ships at anchor and went with one vessel to the Cyclops island to search for supplies. He and his companions landed, carrying with them a jar of wine for a present. They wandered about until they came to a large cave which they entered. Finding no one about, they explored it. They found quantities of cheese, pails of milk, lambs, and kids in wooden pens, and dried and salted meat. They ate some of the cheese, drank a few pails of milk, and were about to cook a roast of meat when they heard dreadful noises outside of the cave. Peering out, they saw a frightful giant called Polyphemus. He carried immense bundles of firewood, which he threw to the ground at the mouth of the cave. Then he drove his flock of sheep and goats into the cavern to be milked, and when they were safely in, he moved a large stone, closing the entrance. It was so large a stone that 20 oxen could not move it. As the men quaked with terror, Polyphemus sat down and milked his goats. When he had finished, he turned his great eye around and saw the men who huddled in the shadows of the pens. He spoke to them, and his voice was a dreadful growl that echoed from the dripping walls. "Who are you?" he asked, "and where do you come from?" Odysseus stepped forward and answered him humbly. "We are Greeks," he said, "returning from a great expedition. We have lately won much glory in the conquest of Troy. We are now on our way home, but we are lost. And if you will offer us your hospitality in the name of the gods, we will restock our larders and be on our way." Polyphemus did not answer. He reached out his great hand and seized two of the Greeks as easily as a man picks a handful of grass. He hurled them against the side of the cave and dashed out their brains. As their companions stood watching in horror, he pulled the men apart and ate them up, clothes and all. Then, having made a hearty meal, he stretched himself out on the floor and went to sleep. Odysseus drew forth his sword and was about to kill the giant as he slept. Then he remembered the huge rock that blocks the entrance to the cave. He realized that if he killed the giant, he and the rest of his men would be hopelessly imprisoned and would eventually die of starvation. All night, the men huddled in fright in the dark, damp cave. They were unable to decide what to do. When morning came, they were sunk in hopeless despair. The giant awoke, lazily stretching out his hand, and grabbed two more of the men. He hurled them against the walls and feasted on their flesh until there wasn't a fragment left. Then the giant moved the rock away from the entrance, drove out his flocks, and replaced the rock. When he was gone, the men came out of their hiding places. Odysseus tried desperately to plan how he might avenge the death of his companions and make his escape with his friends. Searching the cave for a weapon, he found a massive tree trunk that had been cut by the Cyclops for a staff. He ordered his men to sharpen the end of it to a fine point. When that was done, they seasoned it in the fire and hid it under the straw on the floor. Then 4 of the boldest were selected, and Odysseus told them of his scheme. It was almost evening when they had finished their tasks, and they soon heard the Cyclops approaching. He rolled away the stone and drove his flock in as usual. After milking his sheep and goats, he seized 2 more men, dashed their brains out, and made his evening meal. After the giant had supped to his content, Odysseus approached him and handed him a bowl of wine, saying, "Cyclops, this is wine. Taste it and drink after eating your meal of man's flesh." The giant was delighted with the taste of the wine and called for more. Odysseus gave him bowl after bowl of the heady drink, and this pleased the giant so much that he promised Odysseus that he would be the last of his party to be devoured. He asked his name, and Odysseus replied, "My name is No Man." When he had drunk the last of the wine, the giant lay down to sleep. Then Odysseus called to his 4 friends, and lifting the staff, they thrust the end of it into the fire until it was red hot. Then they plunged it into the Cyclops' one eye. The monster roared in pain. Odysseus and his men sprang back and hid themselves in the cave. Polyphemus bellowed and called out to the other Cyclops to help him. Hearing his cries, they came from their caves and flocked around his den. "What hurt," they asked, "has caused you to sound an alarm?" "Oh, friends, I die," he answered, "and no man gave the blow." "If no man gave the blow," they said, "then you have been killed by a blow from Zeus, and you must bear it." They turned away from the cave, leaving him groaning on the ground. He was not dead, only wounded, and in the morning he rolled the whole huge stone aside and led his flocks out to pasture. Although he couldn't see, he stood at the entrance of the cave to feel everything that passed him, so that Odysseus and his men should not escape. Earlier, Odysseus had told his companions to harness the rams of the flock 3 abreast with willow branches, which they found on the floor of the cave. To the middle ram of each group of 3, one of the Greeks hung, protected on either side by the other 2 rams. One by one, the men swung from the shaggy coats of the rams. As they passed the giant, he felt the animals' backs and sides, but he never thought to feel their bellies. So all the men escaped. Odysseus was the last one who passed. Once outside the cavern, the men released themselves and ran to the ship, driving the flock before them. They hastened aboard and pushed off from the shore. When they seemed to be at a safe distance away, Odysseus shouted out, "Cyclops, the gods have repaid you for your atrocious deeds. It is Odysseus to whom you owe your loss of sight." The Cyclops, hearing this, bellowed in rage, and seizing a huge rock from the side of the mountain, he hurled it with all his might in the direction of the ship. Down it came, just clearing the vessel's stern. The ocean heaved and threw the ship once more toward the land, and it barely escaped from being dashed against the shore. The sailors pulled away with the utmost difficulty. Odysseus was about to call to the giant again, but his friends begged him not to do so. He waited until they were far out at sea. Then, unable to resist taunting the Cyclops, he called out again. The giant answered him with curses, but his men pulled at their oars and soon reached the rest of the fleet. At once, they set sail again.